Thank you, Ryan, and the panelists. What a great discussion. Very insightful. Hello, my name is Cindy Waldron. I'm the Vice President of Affordable Research and Analytics at Freddie Mac in the Single Family Division. It's with great pleasure that I introduce to you our keynote speaker, Kathryn Edin, PhD. Kathy is one of the nation's leading poverty researchers, working in the domains of welfare and low-wage work, family life, and the neighborhood context through direct and in-depth observations of the lives of low-income populations. She has authored 8 books and around 60 journal articles. Her book, $2 a Day, The Art of Living on Virtually Nothing in America, co-authored by Luke Schaefer, was met with wide critical acclaim. It was included in the New York Times 100 Notable Books of 2015, cited as essential reporting about the rise of destitute families. Kathy is a trustee of the Russell Sage Foundation, was a founding member of the MacArthur Foundation, funded networking on housing and families with young children, and was a past member of the MacArthur Network on the Family and the Economy. In 2014, she was elected to both the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences. She was elected to the National Academy of Social Insurance in 2017 and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2019. In 2023, Kathy will launch her new book, The Injustice of Place, Uncovering the Legacy of Poverty in America. Today, Kathy's keynote address will be on the poverty and housing hardship in America. Kathy, thank you so much for agreeing to participate in this year's Rural Research Symposium. We're very excited to have you.
Thank you so much, Cindy. So, as Cindy alluded to, in 2015, Luke Schaefer and I published this book, chronicling the lived experiences of America's poorest families. And 2 years later, a program officer from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation called us up. She'd read the book, and she wondered if we would be willing to turn our research lens toward America's poorest places, and to do so in a multidimensional way. So I have to say, this really resonated with us. Americans usually measure poverty by calculating whether someone's income is above or below some minimal threshold. But Luke and I, my co-author, had really grown dissatisfied with this approach. When we talk about poverty, after all, what we're really saying is that someone has an inadequate level of well-being. So, though income is one important way to measure poverty, it captures the business cycle, is a point-in-time measure. We wanted another set of measures that were cumulative, that it kind of captured well-being over the life course. So we chose 2 health measures, low birth weight, which captures well-being at the beginning of life, and life expectancy, which captures well-being at the end of life. We also wanted structural measures. Different places in the United States offer different kinds of opportunity. And so we included the rate of intergenerational mobility in our index as well. And so we took these 5 factors and brought them together into one data set and used an approach called principal components analysis to rank every city and every county in the United States on its level of disadvantage, or what we came to call deep disadvantage. Now, you may not know this, but the 3 authors of this study, myself, Luke, and another researcher from Princeton, Tim Nelson, have spent our whole careers studying urban poverty. And when this map emerged, we were stunned, because after all, this is a rural map. Not only were the not only this, but the rural areas that came to mind were not necessarily those that come to mind, or that appeared on this map, were not necessarily those that come to mind most quickly for most Americans. The upper Midwest, where I'm from, it does not show up on this map. Indeed, outside of Native nations, we can see that all are really clustered in the 14 southern states. The highest rates of disadvantage were in fact concentrated in just 4 regions, which you see here. Central Appalachia, South Texas, the tobacco region of the coastal Carolinas known as the PD, and of course the historic Cotton Belt, really stretching from the Carolinas all the way into the Delta sections of Arkansas and Louisiana. We want to note here that we were unable to conduct any research in a tribal community due to both pragmatic and ethical concerns. So in 2019, right before the pandemic, we began embedding ethnographic researchers in these regions, observing community life and interviewing poor residents and community leaders alike. But then the pandemic intervened. And while trapped at home, we began to delve into the history of each region. Now, this was a critical turning point in this research. Our deep dive into history revealed that these regions had remarkably similar histories. First was the level of resource extraction and human exploitation, not seen to the same degree elsewhere in the US. Second, those who controlled the resources in the area weren't really content with a modest living secured on the family farm. Rather, their goal from the outset was to amass vast wealth on the backs of the laboring class. Third, one industry in each place came to dominate the economy. This industry was linked to national and global markets, and in each case, this economy held until about the 1960s. Finally, in each place, the pattern had emerged, or in the case of King Cotton, had suddenly flourished in the late 19th century, reaching a zenith in the 1920s and 1930s. So what I've done now is to include some pictures so you can get a sense of what these places were like, what they looked like physically, and who were the laborers in each of these places, circa about 1930, 1940, 1950, when these economies were really in their height. So this is the Mississippi Delta, part of the Great Cotton Belt, circa 1920, and cotton production was actually significantly higher after rather than before the Civil War. So that's the courthouse right in the back there in Greenwood, Mississippi. These are coal miners in Clay County, Kentucky, circa 1940, mining one of the mines along Horse Creek. These are women who are working the spinach harvests in the Winter Garden region of South Texas. At this time, this region produced more spinach than anywhere else in the world, and children, as well as women and men, worked these fields. And finally, these are tobacco workers in the PD region of South Carolina. They're stringing tobacco into hands to help prepare the tobacco for market. And since we've got a crowd interested in housing, I wanted to also show you some of the housing conditions. So this is a typical migrant home in Crystal City, Texas, circa 1940. This is the same, but for Central Appalachia. This is Clay County, Kentucky, where we did our ethnographic research. But this picture was taken in the mid-1960s, and so conditions were really harsh well into the 60s in many of these places for laborers. This is the Mississippi Delta, also in the mid-1960s. Very, very typical shared housing there. You can see very small houses, and all these places, family sizes among laborers were large. So what did we take away from this deep dive into history? It's that we shouldn't have been surprised by our map of deep disadvantage at all. After all, these places had been deeply disadvantaged for more than a century. Indeed, they were the very places that in the 1960s gave the war on poverty its face. Both RFK and Johnson visited these places as part of their poverty tours. This was sobering because we realized that if we couldn't identify the mechanisms that link the present to the past, it might be that we would be staring at this same map 20, 30, 50, even 100 years from now. So our visits to these places and our embedded field work resumed. And as we went back to these places over and over again, talking with people, participating to the extent we could in community life, 7 mechanisms emerged that explained the link between the past and the present. I'm going to talk about 5 of them here. So in each of these regions, before Brown versus Board of Education, segregation by race and ethnicity was upheld by law. So this allowed for sharply different educational systems for the haves and the have-nots to emerge. In the Cotton Belt South, per pupil funding was wildly disparate by race. Black parents actually had to supply their own buildings, along with their own desks, textbooks, chalkboards, even stoves. Black teachers were seldom adequately prepared or compensated compared to their white counterparts. Many Black high schools lacked a 12th grade, forcing any Black child who wanted to go to college to actually attend boarding school, which many could not afford. But most consequential was the length of the school year, which, due to the demands of tenant farming, was often limited by local school boards to only 5 months for Black children, compared to 9 months for white children. Without going into great detail, things were so similar in South Texas that one Chicano activist determined the situation Jim Crow in a sombrero hat. Now, after Brown was outlawed, after segregation was outlawed in 1954, the White Citizens Council, nicknamed the Downtown Klan, successfully resisted integration through the Cotton Belt for more than a decade. Yet, seeing the winds of change coming with the civil rights movement of 1964, they changed strategies, setting up hundreds of whites-only segregation academies across the South. Here's a 1964 cover of the White Citizens Council publication, The Citizen. This issue promises a step-by-step set of instructions to any white parent who wants to set up their own segregation academy. Now, you may be surprised to learn that many of these schools survive today, including one in LaFleur County, our research site, which was founded by the same man who founded the White Citizens Council itself. As a result, many Cotton Belt school districts are nearly as segregated today as they were before the Brown decision. Now, over in South Texas, many school districts did integrate after Brown, but maintained de facto segregation in elementary school, while ensuring that few Anglo students would share classrooms with Hispanic classmates versus a racialized tracking system. Now, in Zavala County, county seat, Crystal City, informal quotas ensured that white students assumed the positions of prestige in the school. Whites were homecoming king and queen. They dominated student government. All but one coveted spot on the cheerleading team was guaranteed to white girls. But in the spring of 1969, students at Crystal City High, led by the aspiring cheerleaders, revolted against these informal quotas, the lack of Mexican-American teachers, punishments for speaking Spanish, and the dearth of Hispanic heritage taught at the school, leading to a walkout of 1,700 students, including those in elementary and middle school, as seen here. Only with federal intervention did the students win concessions after many months of protest. But in the following year, the Anglos had their revenge. All but a handful of Anglo students fled the school, leaving it 98% Hispanic by the end of the year, as it remains today. Across South Texas, similar stories of Anglo flight have led South Texas classrooms deeply segregated. Now, in Central Appalachia, inequality between the haves and the have-nots has been maintained by a different process, funding inequalities between poor and rich districts, i.e. those in eastern Kentucky, like this school in Barstow, which Robert Kennedy visited as part of his 1968 poverty tour, and better off districts in the rest of the state. In fact, the differences were so stark that the Kentucky Supreme Court rendered the whole system unconstitutional and demanded redress. Yet large differences remain. So in some, separate and highly unequal schools pervade these regions and are a tragedy of massive proportions. And this is perhaps why adult literacy rates in these regions are the lowest of anywhere in the United States. As many of you know, Central Appalachia has been ravaged by the opioid crisis. Clay County, our research site, has been a poster child of this epidemic. Even today, there are, and get this number, 1.3 opioid prescriptions for every man, woman, and child in the county, down for about twice that many at the epidemic's height. While reliable data on addiction is not available for every county and city, deaths due to overdose are. And this is a map of overdose deaths in the US for 2014. I should note that more recent data shows the same exact pattern. Now, while conducting research in our field site of Clay County, we heard the same refrain over and over again. People blamed the epidemic on the fact that, quote, there's nothing to do here but drugs. People talked a lot about how the bowling alley had closed. They mourned the movie theater that had been sold to a Pentecostal church. A state highway project had bulldozed the park with the best playground. The beauty parlors and barbershops were one by one closing. Now, at first we were tempted to dismiss this claim, but eventually we began to take it seriously. So what if, we wondered, the health of the community indeed rested on social infrastructure, a term coined by the sociologist Eric Kleinenberg to denote the physical elements of the community that act as a conduit to bring people together and build social capital, places open to everyone that knit a community together, creating a community-wide safety net that protects against threats like an epidemic. So we turned to big data, and we learned that the places scoring highest on our index of deep disadvantage had the lowest levels of social infrastructure in the nation. Further, when we measured change in the rate of overdose deaths and mapped it against change in social infrastructure or a loss of social infrastructure over time, we saw that the relationship was strong enough to rival other common predictors of overdose death, such as income or employment. Now, this is a map of a closely related indicator put together by researchers at Penn State University. This measure includes several indicators of social infrastructure. And as you can see, there's a striking correspondence between that indicator and the pattern of overdose due to drugs that I just showed you. Now, when living and working in LaFleur County, Mississippi, and its county seat, Greenwood, people we talked to on the mostly white north side of town told us that the county's biggest problem was how to lure more manufacturing into the city and how to fix the public schools. But when we talked to people on the mostly black south side, the number one concern was not jobs or schools. It was violence. People were literally hunkered down in their homes, afraid even to attend the church picnic or the Christmas parade. We had not anticipated this. So we turned again to big data, and we found that the places scoring highest on our index were the most violent places in the nation, based on the most reliable data available, and that is deaths due to interpersonal violence. So this was really perplexing. What could be the cause? And to find answers, we turn back to the history of these regions. From eminent scholars such as the sociologist Charles S. Johnson, Allison Davis, Hortense Powdermaker, and Paul Taylor, to name a few, all writing nearly a century ago, we learned that the have-nots in these regions, particularly in the Cotton Belt South, had been subject to severe violence for generations, all for the purpose of keeping the have-nots down. This slide reminds us that slavery itself was a profound form of violence. But note the striking resemblance between the map showing the rate of enslavement in 1860 and our map of deep disadvantage today. The very gradations against the counties are across the counties are striking in their similarity. And we find a similar correspondence with the number of lynchings in a county between 1880 and 1940 and our index today. As these striking continuities indicate, the strategy of the landowning class was to keep the landless down, and it was an unqualified success. So keep your eyes for a minute on the bottom of the map. The top, of course, is something I'll tell you about in a minute. But the rates of intergenerational mobility in these areas have been extraordinarily low throughout history, and as that bottom map shows, remain so today. So in light of this, we turn to big data, asking whether the mechanism linking the present to the past was this very mobility that the violence was meant to prevent. And by using measures of intergenerational mobility, we found this was indeed the case. A very large portion of the variation in violence across counties in the present day can be accounted for by the rate of intergenerational mobility in a place in the recent past. So in short, violence suppresses mobility, and indeed, that's exactly what violence was meant to do in the history of each of these regions. But suppressed mobility, in turn, sparks violence. And this creates a structural cycle of violence that continues to plague these places today. No one could spend time in any of these regions and not note the rampant corruption. The so-called welfare scandal in Mississippi involving NFL quarterback Brett Favre is now all over the news. But it all started with a nonprofit run by a LaFleur County native who conspired with the head of Human Services to steer millions of welfare dollars meant for poor kids to other purposes, such as funding the stay of a pro wrestler at a Malibu rehab center, building a volleyball stadium at Brett Favre's alma mater, where his daughter was on the team, and outright graft. Meanwhile, Mississippi has the highest child poverty rate in the nation and was rejecting 98% of those applying for welfare aid, a figure that is only slightly higher today. The story in Texas is around civic leaders who have routinely gone to jail for everything from bringing in illegal casinos to accepting bribes in return for lucrative government contacts. However, nowhere was the corruption more rampant than in Central Appalachia, as we would learn had been true for a century or more. Most notably, the practice of vote buying that had rendered the franchise meaningless for the have-nots living in Central Appalachia for generations. In Clay County, civic leaders were even in bed with the drug dealers who were flooding the county with illegal opioids and methamphetamines. Community outrage led to this march in 2004, led by Pastor Ken Bolin, who you can see here. Fully a tenth of the population showed up at this march to protest the corruption and to stand up to the drug dealers. A slate of other civic leaders decided to run against the ruling political elite that had controlled the county for more than 150 years. But they made the mistake of relying on the age-old Eastern Kentucky tactic of vote buying to succeed, which led to their own indictments. As a result, during the early and mid-2000s, nearly every civic leader in the county was convicted for public corruption or other crimes. As you can see, this Harvard study shows that corruption is especially likely to plague states with the deepest disadvantage, like Kentucky, Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. Corruption pervades these regions. It corrodes civic trust. Consequentially, it defeats any effort to bring new investment into these regions, creating economic backwaters that can't attract new sources of jobs. Now, when we arrived in Marion County, South Carolina, the suffering that had ensued in the wake of not one, but two back-to-back hurricanes was so evident. Florence and Matthew had hit the coastal PD region of the state hard, as rains led the Lumber River to overflow its banks multiple times. In the larger towns of Marion and Mullen, these were spared, but two smaller municipalities, the all-black Sellers and Nichols, in which a little over half the population was white, were inundated by floodwaters, as this photo shows. Nichols, in the end, Nichols and its rural surrounds would receive considerable aid, while the homes of most Sellers residents would be left to molder. Now, as is so often the case, the devil was in the details. Most white residents held clear title to their homes, while many blacks had inherited their properties informally, a practice known as heirs property. Now, these homeowners had faithfully paid their taxes, but without clear title, they were not eligible for aid. Another big problem was that more black owners lived in a floodplain and were required to spend thousands of dollars to elevate their homes if they were to qualify for any assistance. A third dilemma was that the aid was pegged to the market value of the homes, and the homes of many black residents had little market value. As a result, many white homeowners in Marion County were actually better off after the flooding than before, while the opposite was true for black homeowners, who either remained in their moldering homes or were displaced altogether. Now here's the mayor of Sellers, Barbara Hopkins, inspecting one of her constituents' moldering homes. And here in a floodplain, we see that one homeowner has been able to afford to elevate the home, while another has not, and the home has been unimproved. Now, due to the mistrust these inequities caused, many black homeowners we talked to were too fed up even to apply for aid, a policy feedback loop that further exacerbated inequalities inherent in government policy. And here you can, sorry about that. Here you can see the final result of all of these pernicious processes. Residents of mostly white Sellers received about $5 million. Nichols residents received a tenth of that. So these, and other research shows that this is not just Marion County. This is a common outcome in the face of disaster. So the very policies meant to help in the face of disaster in these rural areas have often exacerbated, not mitigated, pre-existing inequalities. So what do we take away? First, it's really important for researchers and people who seek to intervene or invest in communities to understand their histories, because history can cast a very long shadow. And in fact, the housing conditions in a place are often, I think of them almost as fossils that show are a physical manifestation of the economic and social relations that have held within a place for generations. Second, we can learn a lot by combining big data, ethnography, and historical analysis. And by doing so, we can understand what mechanisms are connecting the present to the past. And finally, once we identify those mechanisms, this can lead to innovative policy solutions that move beyond the one-size-fits-all policies that American policy makers usually rely on. So here, I think the policies are fairly obvious. The first is a big ask, but we did it before. and we can do it again. Separate and unequal schooling must end. We must come to terms with this all of these years later after Brown. Second, and this really isn't in the conversation about violence, mobility is key to ending violence. People need hope. There needs to be a sense that young people have a future. So as part of any robust anti-violence intervention, mobility has to be at the heart of it. Third, roughly a century ago, Carnegie went around setting up libraries. These are really, really important features of the community. Movie theaters, bowling alleys, libraries with programming that bring young and old, rich and poor together, are the glue that hold communities together and can guard against a vulnerability to epidemics like the opioid epidemic. Finally, we've got to root out, second to the last, we've got to root out corruption. These places will remain economic backwaters if public trust is not restored. And finally, we really need to inventory our federal and state government programs because they're often riddled with structural racism. We need to make it visible and we need to root it out. Next slide. Sorry, there we go. Now, some people say to me, why invest in these regions at all? After all, rural America is shrinking. Why do we care? I have a lot of different answers to that question, but I want to show you the best answers of all with a series of pictures that speak louder than words. So I told you that Crystal City, Texas was once the spinach capital of the world. In fact, it has a huge statue of Popeye that sits downtown because when Popeye the Sailor Man came on the scene, spinach consumption increased in the United States by 40%. So every year, this town still celebrates this legacy, and they have a parade through town, and they elect a spinach queen. And this is the 2018 Junior Spinach Queen riding in her float through town. This is an arts program in the middle of the Mississippi Delta at Greenwood, Mississippi, where this little boy is having so much fun playing with color. This is the Redbird Mission, way down on the southern tip of Clay County in a very, very rural area. This mission for over a century has served the very poorest Appalachians, Central Appalachians in the region. And this little girl is, of course, learning how to write her name. And finally, here in Marion County, South Carolina, the town of Marion every fall hosts an event that encourages families with children to go fishing. And so here's a volunteer, helping this little guy out as he, quote unquote, catches his first fish. He looks a little terrified, but mom is proudly taking pictures with her smartphone. Thank you.
Kathy, what great historic information on poverty and housing. Let me ask you this. Based on the areas that you've what are some of the histories of the civil rights and how effective were they?
So this is a fantastic question. These places were actually the cradle of civil rights activity. Greenwood, Mississippi, of course, was where the summer project called Freedom Summer was headquartered. And it was also where the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party launched its offensive against the Democratic slate from Mississippi and went to Atlantic City and demanded with the Democratic National Convention to be seated, led by Fannie Lou Hamer in her famous voice. So you can't find a place more central to civil rights than Greenwood, Mississippi. Same could be said for Crystal City, Texas. That walkout by the students I showed you, that was followed by a huge, both preceded and followed by a huge amount of civil rights activity that finally got rid of the white a white primary and gained suffrage and equal schooling for Hispanics living in the region. And of course, you can't talk about labor history without talking about Central Appalachia. Just over from Clay is, of course, Harlan. You've probably seen the movie Harlan County, USA, about the famous strike there in the 70s. But it's this area is just full of civil rights history. And unfortunately, despite the courage of the activists that fought for civil rights, elite backlash was severe. And so in another part of this project, we really chronicle that backlash. So if you ask people, did we gain, from all of this civil rights activity, they'll point both to the fact that they can now vote. The people in Crystal City who were in the fields as kids, traveling up and down the United States, picking soybeans, cherries, cucumbers, and of course spinach back home, now have PhDs. So tremendous gains, but the places themselves have really experienced some severe backlash, and so the gain was not without pain.
So based on your response, I really want to better understand, what can we learn, right? So everything that you've been teaching and telling us today, what is it that you want us to learn from the current research, and also, your new book that's coming out? What is it that you can give us?
So what I presented here is kind of the stuff of the book that'll be coming out in next summer, called The Injustice of Place, just like this talk. But I think what we learn is that we actually have to address the past if we want to invest in the future. There's no way around it, right? And I need to understand the precise mechanisms that link the present to the past. So, and we need to know where to focus our efforts, because there are a lot of problems in these regions. So by, the researcher's job is to identify the problem, and the policymaker's job is to fix it. But what we see this is illustrative of an approach. When you want to intervene in a place, take the time to invest in the big data, the history, and especially by talking to community residents and spending time in the communities and coming to understand the people who are living there. Because then you can intervene in ways that will really matter. You're not skirting around the problem. You're really identifying the crux of the problem. I'm studying some anti-violence programs in Chicago that are really promising, but they really focus on the individual, right? And it's great if you can get a young person to avoid shooting another young person. That is an incredible thing to be able to, for these anti-violence programs to achieve. But what then? Are there jobs? Is there opportunity in the community? Because ultimately, that violence problem will rear its head again and again unless mobility, as well as individual level interventions, are employed. So I think this approach also shows you the depth of these problems. It's easy to tell ourselves that an intervention is gonna have a significant effect, but I think by understanding the depth of the problem, we have to be honest with ourselves about the kind of political will we need to bring to these problems, but the seriousness with which we have to address them. So, we have programs that are aimed to help Appalachia and the Mississippi Delta. We have a lot of place-based interventions, a little bit here, a little bit there, but they don't work very well. And I think this research shows that's why. It's not enough to build a pipe plant in Tunica, Mississippi, and end poverty when a casino just closed, ending 13,000 jobs. And that pipe factory created about 300 jobs. So, it really, I think, reveals the depth of the problem in these regions.
Thank you, Kathryn, for really highlighting the poverty in housing, the history of it, and really kind of giving us some thought-provoking insights on what to do next. Your work is really meaningful, and we really appreciate it. So thank you very much. Before we wrap up for day one, I want to thank everyone for their contributions to today's symposium. We have been able to hear research on many aspects of housing and rural communities. At this time, we invite you to attend our virtual networking lounge, where you have the opportunity to chat with some of today's presenters, as well as your peers. Just click the Networking Lounge tab at the banner above to enter the Networking Lounge. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you will be back tomorrow morning. Doors open early at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for the continuation of our symposium. We will hear from researchers who will share key data and insights on manufactured and factory-built housing, as well as factors influencing affordability in rural rental markets. I look forward to seeing you in the Networking Lounge. Thank you.